Thank you. Wow, that was really loud when I put my phone down. Sorry. Okay, so hello, everybody. I am Mia O'Hara, and I'm a learning teaching librarian. And for the past year, I've been working with a cross-college team of researchers doing research into education for sustainable development in higher education for what used to be called the Higher Education Academy and is now Advanced HE. We're quite a big group. So I'm part of the team, but I'm only helping look after the baby. It's really Dr. Mira Vogel's baby. She's the one who acts as, she's a senior lecturer in education for King's Academy, which is our team that teaches teaching staff to teach. And she's the lead for sustainable education and inclusive education. So it's really her project, and I'm just involved in it because I've collaborated with her in the past, developing teaching sessions for helping people who want HEA fellowship and senior fellowship research educational literature effectively, as they were finding a lot of people who were applying for that were not using any references from this century, and they thought maybe there was a need there to support teaching staff in developing their research skills. But it's quite a large team. I won't go through everyone because I'm conscious of time as well. But what I'm going to cover today is, first of all, what is education for sustainable development? Some of our preliminary findings on how it's actually being taught in higher education, how it's impacted my teaching over the past year in libraries, and then I also have some slides on our approach to the literature review for anybody who's geeking out and wants to look at the methodology. But I'm not going to actually talk about that because it's boring, and I want to talk about the interesting bits. So first of all, what is education for sustainable development? And I've got here a QR code if you want to scan it on your phones with a very quick quiz for you to fill in. I'll give you a minute to do it. Just with some quick questions like, what is education for sustainable development? How much do you already know about it? Probably more than most people in any university in England, to be honest. I can see people putting their phones up, so that's reassuring. And I can read out the questions as well for anybody who doesn't want to go on it. First is, how many UN Sustainable Development Goals are there? Which Anya's really spoiled for everybody. She gave you the answer in the last presentation. It's multiple choice. Second one is, which of these do the UN Sustainable Development Goals not seek to address? The options are unsustainable use of resources, e-book pricing models, climate change, inequality, or loss of biodiversity. And then the third question is, what is the difference between education about sustainable development and education for sustainable development, which I'll let you look at yourself, and I can see 11 people have filled it in. Not everybody's getting it right, and I'm particularly enjoying that some people are getting it wrong the exact same way I always get it wrong. I always think there's 16 sustainable development goals, and there aren't, so that's really reassuring to me personally. Everybody's putting down e-book pricing models as one of the key things that they want. Oh, that is the right answer. The way I phrased the question, that's right. Although you could argue that it does map, because, you know, when we think about equitable access to information, getting fair and equitable e-book pricing models does map to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a social justice thing there. Okay, that's probably a minute, so we'll move on. So yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals, for me, one of the really nice things about them is they kind of tie in very closely with our values as a profession. As librarians, you know, it's about fair play, it's about trying to help others and support others, and really make the world a bit of a better place. So it's no surprise that if we look at IFLA, we can see libraries around the world are mapping what they do to the Sustainable Development Goals. Like, that is something we can do, often without even starting up new initiatives, although they do help. And yeah, if you're a teaching librarian like us, then Goal 4 does map on very nicely, because information literacy is a key life skill for lifelong learning, for being able to negotiate the world around us. So if you're teaching information literacy, you are supporting the development of the Sustainable Development Goals here. You are supporting them in our society, which is brilliant. But when we look at education for sustainable development, I think one of the things that really strikes me about that is it sort of tries to move beyond information about sustainable development, which is clearly important, but also giving people the values, the skills, and the agency. So sort of moving people beyond just knowing that these problems exist, knowing that they are problems and not denying them like certain former presidents of the United States would, and actually thinking about how can we get people to a point where they feel able to take action and to to actually build this better world that we're trying to reach here. And I think that's really a key part of it. That is, for me, the key difference. And when we look at it within higher education, as somebody who's been reviewing the literature on the topic for the last year, one of the really key thinkers that comes out of this is Weick et al.'s key competencies for sustainability. And that's really the key measure that people are often using when they're looking at the literature and when they're assessing teaching in this area. So there's 5 key competencies in sustainability. We've got the systems thinking competency, which is, being able to analyze the world around us, complex governments, economies, and sort of see how their actions might have consequences and how they're, cumulative, so like individual actions will pile up. We've got anticipatory competence, which is, looking at the information we've got available and figuring out what's likely to happen as a result. And normative competence, being able to look at, okay, this is the current situation, and this is actually where we want to get to, and setting yourself some goals. Strategic competency, getting from where the current situation to those goals collaboratively, and interpersonal competence, which is, being able to motivate and collaborate and work together to move beyond individual action into, collective action. So instead of, for example, cutting down on your own plastic use, doing what University College Cork did and getting rid of all plastics on campus, and then accidentally, in an unanticipated consequence, getting all the students to drink Monster energy drinks instead, which is weird. So that's kind of a little bit of a grounding in sort of what we were looking at when we were looking at education for sustainable development. So now I'm going to talk a bit about our preliminary findings. To be clear, we're currently on our second draft of it, so we're still working on this, and these are kind of me picking out some of the key themes that Mira and I spotted coming out of the literature when we talked about this. So first of all, one thing that's really jumped out is how often ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, is really being driven right now by passionate individuals. And that's great, passion is fantastic, but it does have some downsides as well, because when it is all sort of flying on a single individual, they can feel a bit like they've got the weight of the world on their shoulders here, and they can be at higher risk of burnout. But also, it means that within the literature, what we were often seeing was there were some weaknesses being brought into the research literature by this. So, for example, a lot of the time when we were seeing people writing up about projects they'd been doing, they didn't actually, that we had the same people sort of designing the teaching interventions, then doing maybe interviews with students, and then actually analysing and publishing it. So that kind of changes the nature of how much students are maybe willing to tell you about your teaching. Because if they're being interviewed about how their class last semester went by the person who taught their class last semester, they're going to give a different answer than if they're being interviewed by maybe a group of students who are doing research into ESD at the institution, or a completely different lecturer or member staff that they've never met before. So that was a bit of a research weakness, and that we were seeing that. And as I said, it does also create these single points of failure. And it means that if that member staff leaves, what happens to the Education for Sustainable Development on that course in that department? Does it disappear? Does it get cut down? And as someone who has been embedding this in my teaching and is about to leave my current department, that's something I feel quite strongly about right now. So our recommendation for this was kind of find and join networks in your institution more widely, in your communities in higher education in your country, to actually get a bit of a support network and get ideas on how you can move beyond that individual and make it more of a collective effort, collaborative effort within the institution. So at King's, for example, last, I think it was October, I ended up at the stall beside our sustainability stall during a welcome fair. And from that, Mira and I ended up joining the Climate Action Network at King's, and got slotted in very quickly to the ESD working group they've got set up. So we accidentally picked up some extra work from networking. It was tragic, but kind of fun. The next thing we found was one of the reasons we do have a lot of these individuals who are carrying this work on their shoulders is people just don't feel like they know enough about sustainable development. They don't feel authoritative enough to be able to teach this. They feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. They see there are so many different parts. If we think about those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they don't know enough about every part of it to be able to actually embed it in their teaching and actually take it on, because what if somebody asks them a question they don't know the answer to? And we've seen this as well with the quality topics as we've been embedding anti-racism in our teaching. I don't know if any of you have heard of Ramona Niker, who created a brilliant checklist for anti-racism as an NHS librarian in the UK, and which we've started using in our quantitative research qualitative sessions for health students and NHS staff at King's. And when we started embedding that within our quantitative sessions, really a lot of our staff, because they were predominantly white, felt really uncomfortable talking about racism in healthcare, and it took a lot of time to for people to educate themselves about the issues, to figure out what genetic ancestry was, before they felt comfortable actually teaching that. And the Sustainable Development Goals, there's so much to know that we can't know it all, and you have to help people be comfortable with discomfort. But also you can give them space to learn about this and to actually dedicate a bit of time to learning more about sustainable development. One method that came out of the literature review actually as a really effective method for students was action research, which is where people identify a problem, a thing they want to know about, then they do a bit of research and come up with some things that might help them address it, and they embed it in their teaching in this context. And then they have a look at how's that going, is it working, and they decide if they want to stop, start, or continue anything. And this has really emerged as one of the most effective ways of teaching sustainable development. So there's no reason it can't help teachers figure out how to embed it as well. So then the next thing I would really pick up on is that sustainable competencies, they map to existing things that we want to teach in higher education. They map to critical thinking and academic skills. They map to information literacy, because those are core skills for navigating the world. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel with this. And the things that are effective for teaching are, in general, are effective for teaching sustainable development, problem-based learning, project-based learning, particularly interestingly, and a really good one for libraries, community-based learning. So things that anybody does around working with students on things like student champion projects, where students will work on a project within the library, can be really good opportunities for us to embed sustainable development education in not the curriculum, but maybe the extracurricular activities. But another key thing that came out of this is that while people sometimes did tend to jump into the active learning portion of the teaching, sometimes the students reported that they struggled because they didn't know enough about the sustainable development portion of it to really make those connections, and they felt like they didn't have enough information. A bit like the educators, they felt like they didn't know enough to be working on this. So it is important to also give them the core knowledge, even though it's about competencies, they still need to know a little bit about sustainable development in there. It shouldn't all be implicit. So first of all, I think one of the key things is think about how does sustainability intersect with your academic discipline, with what you're teaching, and integrate it into the subject and look at it through the lens of your subject, rather than tagging it on as an extra or completely a separate thing. Put it in there and embed it in the session as a whole. And also explicitly do introduce the relevant ESD concepts, because students won't necessarily, some of them will, but not all of them are going to recognize implicit links and things that you see. They're not necessarily going to see them, and it will help them picture themselves as able to build a more sustainable world if you have made those explicit links between what you're teaching and being able to work and operate sustainably in their careers. All right, so how have I used this? How am I doing for time, by the way?
6 minutes, yeah.
Oh my God, this is amazing. All right, so how have I integrated this into library instruction in my work at King's? Well, I have to say, when I started off and Mira came to me with this project, I was like, oh yeah, this sounds really important. This sounds really good. This sounds like it has nothing to do with information literacy. It's nothing to do with me, but everybody else should definitely be doing it. And whenever I think back on the teaching I was doing at the time, I did have a bit of an influence. I was developing some e-learning for the science faculty at the time, and I chose a green-themed example question, which we went from green tech to the question takes them through into looking at renewable energy. So, I did make some changes. It did have an impact. It gave me a chance to learn a bit about a concept I was interested in. And you could argue that it raises awareness of sustainability in quite an easy way, but realistically, it was very low impact. It doesn't develop any sustainability competencies. It was pretty basic, to be honest. So as I was doing the research and hearing about how other educators have set about embedding this in their teaching, I actually started looking at maybe I could use action research myself to investigate links between information literacy and sustainability and see how this actually does link into what I'm teaching. So I've got a true or false for everybody here. If you think it's true, put your head on your hands on your head. If you think it's false, put them on your chin. The internet produces 2.4% of global CO2 emissions. True or false? We're going with true. It's actually false. Aviation produces 2.4% of global CO2 emissions. The internet is higher. It's 3.7% of CO2 emissions. And I think that's really interesting because as librarians, I don't know about you, I tend to think of the internet, the electronic option, as by default being the green option. And finding out that what we think of as probably one of the dirtiest industries of aviation as being less of a CO2 impact than the internet was really shocking for me. And that started me thinking about, okay, maybe there are some links here. Maybe there's some links between this and getting people to search databases a bit more seriously. So actually, to go into a bit of detail, I dug into searching specifically and found out that a single Google search has a cost of 0.2 grams of CO2 emissions without offsetting in renewables. I don't want Google to sue me. And that's pretty low, but when we are talking about, the environment, we do have to think about the cumulative effort. And 99,000 searches are happening on Google per second. So that quickly piles up to 19,800 grams of CO2 emissions per second from Google searches. But again, to stop Google from suing me, I want to be very clear. They're working towards being carbon-free 24/7 by 2030. That's not necessarily fair to say that that's their output every minute. But I would say, first of all, companies going green only does so much. Our decisions can also help sort of reduce demand, and we do have to think about our actions as individuals. Thank you for the 3-minute warning. And also, I don't know if it's just that I'm Northern Irish, I also tend to be a little bit wary after the Ash for Cash scandal of companies having too big of an influence campaigning for green issues and environmental issues about what their motives might be. I do think we need to consider that. Okay, so then we bring up to where I am now. So I do see how sustainability concepts can be used to reinforce disciplinary knowledge in information literacy, and I can see explicit links between literature searching and ESD. So I also have been developing over the last few months a workshop for natural, mathematical, and engineering sciences on literature searching. And when I was thinking about this, I actually started framing literature searching through a lens of environmental thinking. And when I did this, the content of what I was teaching didn't change a huge amount. The 3 staples of our literature searching sessions tend to be plan your search before you run it, choose where the right place to find information for your subject is, and use advanced search techniques or search techniques to build an efficient search strategy and find focused results. And those didn't change when I started looking at it through the lens of environmental thinking, with the possible exception of choosing the right place to look, because I have to admit, sometimes we can be a little bit lazy in that section and just give people a link to the library guide and the tab on the library guide on finding information in databases for your subject, which isn't really the best way to teach that. So I started building up something that's a little bit more developing people's critical thinking about where to go and find information. And actually, one thing that I found, and a piece of feedback I got from the senior library assistants at King's who helped me teach this session, is that it really creates a very meaningful narrative on why the different parts of what I'm teaching go together and how they can actually, how it's important, and why people should develop these skills. So environmental thinking did end up enriching the session, I feel. Although we've only delivered it 5 times so far, so I don't have enough feedback yet. So now we've got the same quiz again. If you want to scan the QR code for the last 30 seconds and fill it in, it's the same quiz, but the reason I'm doing it is because this is how the majority of the of the research we looked at actually did measure the success and the impact of their teaching. They did a survey before the session started. They did a session at the end of it, and that again shows like the weaknesses in the research and how maybe we need to. It's quite difficult to measure the success of ESD teaching, and we need to build up more robust structures to help us do that. All right,